with our Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, and with liberty and justice for all.
If you wish, Mr. Dorsey, we could proceed to the ED report and come back to the chairman's reports.
Sure. And Mr. Bean, should we go ahead and take roll call and just cover logistics?
I'm pleased to go ahead with the ED report, giving Robert just a little bit more time, and then he can get the logistics and we can do the, oh, there he is, Mr. Chairman.
My apologies. I was chairing another hearing, so I very much apologize for being a little bit tardy. I appreciate your patience, and I promise you we will still wrap up on time and keep everything moving. Thank you for filling in for me, Chuck. Good afternoon. I'm Councilmember Robert White. I'm the current COG Board Chair, and I would like to call the May meeting of the COG Board of Directors to order, and I thank everyone for joining us virtually. I am assuming we have a quorum. Is that correct? Yes.
We've not done the roll call yet. We have done the pledge.
Okay. Oh, we've done the pledge. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Then we will move right along to the chairman's report then. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Chuck. I'm sorry. So let me do this. Sorry, pause for a second. After my initial remarks, which will be brief, Monica Nunez, who has been monitoring the participants box, will complete the roll call to document everyone's presence at this meeting and also make sure we have a quorum. As many of you know or recall from our previous meetings, our webinars, audio and video are being live streamed on the COG website through COG's YouTube account. To facilitate questions or comments for our speakers, and we have a couple today, as smoothly as possible during the meeting, there are two options. The first is to indicate in the chat function that you have a question. After I facilitate those, I will verbally call for any questions from each jurisdiction, each state. This is a good moment for folks who are joining us by phone to ask questions. During votes, after a motion to adopt a resolution is made and properly seconded, we will proceed to discussion. After discussion, I'll ask for abstentions and nay votes. I ask that you state your name and jurisdiction as you state your vote. The rest I will take as yes votes. So Monica, if you would please take roll of who is present at today's meeting.
Yes, for the District of Columbia, I have Robert White and Beverly Perry. Is there anyone else from the district? From Maryland, I have Reuben Collins, Michael O'Connor, Denise Mitchell, Colin Bird, Bridget Newton, Kate Stewart, Joy Schaefer, Neil Harris, Emmett Jordan, and Michael Lesk, and Tara Jackson. Are there any additional board members from Maryland?
Timothy Adams.
Great, got you. All right, moving on. From Virginia, I have Christian Dorsey, Penny Gross, Rodney Lusk, David Snyder, Julie Briskman, Phyllis Randall, Daryl Moore, Ann Wheeler, and Andrea Bailey. Are there any additional board members from Virginia? All right, we have a quorum and good to proceed.
Thank you very much. Monica, I want to move on. We only have one announcement for today. I am very excited to share that COG's annual leadership retreat will be happening in person this summer on July 23rd and 24th in Cambridge, Maryland. Because we were virtual last year, we do have a number of COG board members who have not participated in the annual retreat before. And so I just want to make a note of how beneficial and productive it is. This is where we really drill down on the issues that we are moving along during the year. But we hear from experts. We are able to have much longer conversations. Frankly, it's sort of a more informal environment, invites a lot of participation and getting to know each other on a more personal level, which benefits the work that we do here in COG and in our respective jurisdictions. So I've greatly enjoyed it in the past. I know that others have as well, and we really have done work that we can be proud of and that move us along in a significant way. So I hope folks are able to join us for the COG Board retreat this year, which I'm excited. I know many of you will be in person. So look out.
Can you say the dates of that one more time?
Yes, July 23rd and 24th.
Thank you.
And look out for an email later today with additional details on how to RSVP. Questions regarding the retreat can be directed to Pat Warren, who does a lot of work every year to make sure the retreat is seamless and flawless. So at this point, I will now move it to hand it over to Chuck Bean for the Executive Director's report.
Thank you. If staff could bring up the PowerPoint. I'd like to start by highlighting a new program. The Transportation Planning Board has launched its Transit Within Reach program, and this is a new funding opportunity for member jurisdictions and associated agencies. The program funds design and preliminary engineering projects to help improve bike and walk connections to transit. Approximately $80,000 will be available per project, and you can learn more about the program on our website, and I think staff will drop a link in the chat about the program. I'd like to put the program, this new program, into a bigger context. And next slide, please. By 2030, our region will be home to 225 high-capacity transit station areas. 154 of those are on the ground or in development right now, 71 additional by 2030. So these areas, of course, around Metro Rail, but also MARC and VRE, the Purple Line, streetcar, and in the next decade around bus rapid transit. Many of these are multimodal, which might mean they serve both bus rapid transit and commuter rail. These are significant because they represent just 10% of the region's land mass, but these new nodes are where we expect 2/3 of all future job growth to be. So I spoke about these 250 nodes to a group of 200 developers recently at a BizNow event. So this comes to the COG board from a land use perspective, and our regional push ought to be to optimize these 225 nodes. For me, optimizing would be 4 words: density, appropriate density around these places, walkability, optimizing bikeability, and affordability, which is related to our housing targets that came out of the retreat in 2019. So focusing on these high capacity transit nodes helps the region meet its goals for housing, for mobility, and for climate, greenhouse gas targets that were passed in 2020. So next slide. Besides the high capacity transit station areas map for 2030, the other emerging major planning construct is equity emphasis areas. Equity emphasis areas are 350 census tracts throughout the region. About 30% of our population live in these census tracts. These are predominantly low income and or people of color. So at the same time as we seek to optimize the high capacity transit station areas, we need to make sure that the equity emphasis areas are included in these plans for mobility and prosperity. So you'll see in this new Transit Within Reach program, there are bonus points for serving equity emphasis areas. So the coming together of 4 things: this vision for high capacity transit station areas, equity emphasis areas, along with the board's previously ratified 2030 housing targets and 2030 greenhouse gas emission reduction targets, is the opportunity before us to bring these things together and the recommended focus of the retreat. So more on equity emphasis areas next month and in July. In the meantime, lots of info and robust geographic data on our website and staff is including a link to that in the chat. Next slide. At our last CAO's meeting, there were briefings about President Biden's American Rescue Plan and the proposed American Jobs Plan discussed with the CAOs. Staff also provided a memo summarizing the proposed infrastructure investments in the jobs plan. I believe that can be found on page 8 of the board packet. We continue to track developments in this area closely. In addition, we have an update on our enhanced mobility program. I think you remember me announcing a few months ago, special COVID relief funding for the program was approved, over $500,000. Now there's another round under the American Rescue Plan for $591,000 and applications accepted starting May 21st through June 21st. This will be in addition to the regular biennial, twice a year enhanced mobility solicitation, which will be open in July with approximately $6.3 million in funds. And staff are including appropriate links to that chat. Now, before I go to the final slide, a note about COG's telework posture with our staff. I call this return to work. We don't call it reopening because we've been open throughout. We don't call it return to work because we've been working throughout. We call this return to office, RTO. So in this last year, we've been in a maximum telework posture, meaning employees should work from home. Starting June 1, just twisting the dial just a little bit, saying that employees may return to the office. Otherwise, a 5-day telework. Otherwise, 5-day telework is allowed. And that's what we'll be doing through the summer, and we'll be practicing with our multi-mode meetings. I prefer to call them multi-mode meetings rather than hybrid meetings, meaning meetings that can be both in person and virtual. We'll do that through the summer, and then September 1 will be our new telework policy. So in the last year, employees have proven that they can be productive from home. But it's also true that an aspect of productivity is not just individual productivity, but collective productivity, what we can do together. So starting September 1, we'll go to a 3 days maximum telework posture. So staff will have time in the office and will be allowed also to work from home. So we compare it to 2019, I'd say that some staff did some telework maxing out at 2 days. Starting September, I would see that most staff will do some telework and some staff maxing out at 3 days. Happy to follow up offline if you are interested in more details. That's the staff posture. I'll have more to say and discuss with the board and get your input on in-person meetings. We'll start that discussion in June and carry that discussion in July at the retreat. So last slide, please. Well, sometimes publicly underappreciated, I wanted to give a shout out to our finance and contracting staff. There's a lot of items related to finance and contracting in today's board meeting. This is our finance and administrative services team. I think of them as mission support. Often working simultaneously on auditing last fiscal year, managing the current fiscal year, and budgeting for the next fiscal year. These are the people developing a clean audit and helping us get to a balanced budget, procuring properly while adhering to often complex federal and state rules and dozens of funding sources. So thank you to Julie and Robin and Rosita and Rick and Simone and Laura and Gail and Ivilo and Anna and Chris and Amanda and Tabitha, Zwang and Derek. Thank you all. These folks come from Asia and Caribbean, from Europe, and of course from the DMV to be COG's mission support. So special shout out to them. I want to thank them. Mr. Chairman, happy to answer questions about anything that I've covered, or happy to comment on Colonial Pipeline or anything else pressing for the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chuck. Are there questions for the executive director?
Yes, this is Ruben from Chuck County, and I wanted to thank Chuck for that presentation. I believe this is more of an update. During the most recent legislative session in Maryland, the state of Maryland approved funding for Southern Maryland Rapid Transit. This has been a very important project in terms of the development of Charles County. And quite frankly, that project was the impetus in convincing Charles County government, to recognize the significance of being a part of COG, and prior to being full members, we were a part of, the transportation initiative, but our full directive membership was really based on, this particular project. And I'm proud to say that during this most recent session, the state of Maryland approved very significant NEPA and environmental study money to move forward with this project that is a partnership with Prince George's County, because at the end of the day, it's a regional measure. 3/4 of the actual alignment is in Prince George's County, but it greatly impacts Charles County. And so, I wanted to certainly let everyone know the significance of this. Now, with the funding, it does require federal matching funds. But, our federal delegation has been in tune with this for years, so with the present administration in place, we're very excited about the prospects of this. Chuck, being and early on in your tenure here, you visited Charles County, you saw the work that we were doing in terms of, actual redevelopment within the Waldorf area to ensure that transit-oriented development was in place to make this thing happen. So, I just wanted to let the entire board understand the importance of this and to please put this on the radar of COG, because it's no longer, this out of, reality kind of measure. It's becoming something fully a part of our interests in this region. And I just wanted to share that.
Thank you, Mr. Collins.
Thank you very much. And I see Penny Gross, who did a wonderful job on a Kojo Nnamdi Politics Hour last week, I should say. Ms. Gross, please.
Thank you so much. It's sort of interesting to hear how many people actually listen to that program. Chuck, question for you. You had said something about the Colonial Pipeline. Is there any information that is available to COG that we haven't perhaps already heard from through the news reports as to, what the actual potential restart of the pipeline and so forth? We're all hearing about long gas lines and we've seen them in our districts, but is there anything new that we should know? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm aware that staff are communicating with CAOs, with the Homeland Security Executive Committee, and with FEMA. To your precise question of the duration of this, I don't have additional inside information. I'm aware that Governor Northam is speaking at 2:30, and we will likely be having conference calls following that meeting. As I read the emergency declaration from a day or two ago, it impacted procurement and easing procurement, and also motor carrier. I think from a elected official perspective, I would consider hoarding is not necessary kind of message. Gas is being delivered. It's running manually, not automatically. I'm not great with slogans, but hoard gas, no class would be something that comes to mind.
Are there any other questions for, yes, I see Julie and then David Snyder.
Thank you. I had such an interesting conversation with my 16-year-old son about the pipeline and how, we can't just manually go in and turn the thing on in certain areas. Anyway, thank you, Mr. Bean, for your update. And I know that guidance has just come out maybe 2 days ago, or starting of the guidance coming out for the AJP, and I see 213 billion for affordable housing. And I just wanted to know if you have any indications on how that will be distributed, and if there's any indication or availability of funds sort of for revitalization. I see a lot of building new, and maybe traditional infrastructure to be revitalized, but I'm thinking about, you know, areas that need revitalization, such as dead shopping centers and that sort of thing. And that was a lot. That was like 3 questions, sorry.
I would say generally that I do not have additional information about the American Jobs Plan. About the American Rescue Plan, frankly, that's been complicated enough for some municipalities to get answers on something that's already been passed by Congress. Jobs Plan, not gone to Congress yet, so we're maybe 3 steps removed from those kind of details, but I am aware that subject matter experts are studying all of those different potential programs. So we will get back to you when we have more information on that.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chuck. And David Snyder.
Thanks very much. So I have just a couple questions, perhaps for future presentations. One is to follow up on the Colonial Pipeline issue. Are there things that we ought to be doing as a region within government in terms of cybersecurity, as well as with the private sector? So that would be question number 1, to follow up prior questions. Secondly, I'd be interested in when we'll receive a public safety briefing on the level of crime in the region, particularly gun violence. And we normally have an annual briefing on that situation, so I wondered when that will occur. And third, the continuing issue of our climate change obligations and goals in connection with our transportation planning, and is that really running as effectively as it ought to? So those were 3 questions, clearly clusters of sub questions underneath, and I just wondered when we might hear presentations on those topics. Thank you.
Thank you. Quick responses on those 3. Emergency managers and chief information security officers and CEOs. I'm sure aware of the joint cybersecurity advisories, and these are discussed amongst the committees. This is something that we can make more visible to elected officials in the future. The second question, I imagine I'm anticipating the annual regional crime report will be shared with the board this summer. I forget the exact date, but I'll ask staff. It'll be forthcoming to the board. And the third, I think this is partially addressed in item number 12 as we look at the climate energy action plan related to 2030.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Seeing no other questions, this might be a record, Chuck. So great questions. We are decently behind our agenda, so I'm going to speed through the next few things. Agenda item 4 is amendments to the agenda. Are there any amendments to the agenda? Hearing none, we will move on to the next item, approval of minutes from the April 14th, 2021 meeting. Is there a motion and a second to approve the minutes from the April 14th meeting?
Penny Gross moves approval.
Second.
There's a motion and a second. Are there any abstentions or nay votes? Hearing and seeing none, the motion passes. Moving to agenda item 6, the consent agenda. We do have 3 resolutions on the consent agenda today pertaining to updates to COG administrative policies. You can find them on page 24 of your board packet. Is there a motion and a second to approve the 3 consent agenda items?
Penny Gross moves approval.
Supervisor
motion.
Eastman,
Is there a
second.
Thank you very much. Are there any abstentions or nay votes? Hearing none, the motion passes. Now we move to one of the items I love every year, which is foster parent appreciation. As we all know, foster parents play a crucial role in caring for children across the region. They provide our region's youth with unconditional love and safe, supportive, and nurturing homes until children can be reunified with their birth family or achieve permanence through adoption or guardianship. It's my pleasure to recognize this year's 2021 Foster Parents of the Year for their resilience and commitment during such a challenging year. You can read about the Foster Parents of the Year from each jurisdiction and their nominating social worker on page 33 of the board packet. But for your viewing pleasure, we will now play a video highlighting this year's outstanding foster parents of our region.
The most rewarding thing about being a foster parent is just seeing the child happy. At the heart of it is a child who just needs care and just needs love. It's a huge responsibility, but when you see like the outcome of like some of your actions, you're like, wow, I had an impact.
Foster care to us is something that is foundational to the society of how we should work and helping each other out.
It's so incredibly rewarding at the end to see these kids who frequently come into your house with nothing and some huge issues walk away with a feeling of self-worth.
As foster parents, we really relied on each other.
Walk away with a feeling of self-worth.
As foster parents, we really relied on each other, and it brought us really closer. I want them to be responsible for themselves, and these kids are getting there. They really are.
That's pretty much what we want for our own kids, a fairly normal life.
Your heart grows immensely when you love someone else.
Even if you only foster, one child or one placement, you've made a difference in someone's life.
That they remember to be self-confident. They remember that they're loved and that they can do whatever they want to do in life.
Most of all, they come with the need for you to support them. They're going to try you when they come in, but they're trying you to see if you're going to be true. If you're going to stick with me before I invest my feelings, you do reach them in some way. You may not see it while it's in your home, but once they leave, they'll call you, they'll let you know. It's wonderful. It's wonderful to be a part of their lives and to help.
We love building a relationship with birth parents. For me, that's been the most rewarding part of fostering that maybe I didn't see coming initially.
The community around foster care, it's just been a complete pleasure to be a part of. I couldn't imagine our kids, not having experienced this.
It's making those connections between ourselves, our foster children, our biological children, just creating this really large extended family and support group. That's the most important thing that we get out of it.
When we have a placement in our home, it feels complete versus we're missing something.
Almost all the kids we have been 16 or older. It's an age group that we love working with. There's just so many benefits that come with working with these kids. Being able to see them develop really into their own selves and blossom and transition into this early adulthood and be able to walk next to them as they're moving into this next phase of their life.
While you're watching that growth in the kids, you're growing as an individual as well. You're experiencing triumphs together, you're experiencing joy and heartache together, and you get to help this human being be the best version of themselves going forward.
Also gives us an opportunity to not be an observer in life or in society, but to be a participant.
There's times in the life of a family where someone needs help, and to provide that help has such a critical impact on their lives and on their future. And what's most rewarding about foster care for me is being able to fill that gap.
Thank you. That was a very moving video, as it always is. Yeah, absolutely incredible and inspiring. I do want to thank and congratulate the 2021 Foster Parents of the Year. After this meeting, COG staff will share the links to the video we just viewed, in addition to videos on each individual family, so that you can promote them within your respective jurisdictions. Doing this, I think, helps really expand the universe of people who think about the idea of fostering. So there's a lot of good we can do in just sharing and promoting these incredible materials. Moving to agenda item 8, the fiscal year 2021 third quarter financial report. We will hear from COG Secretary Treasurer Rodney Lusk and COG Chief Financial Officer Julie Mussog, who will brief the board on the fiscal year 2021 third quarter financial statements. And I want to join Chuck in thanking them for that entire team for the work that they do. So let me hand it over to Mr. Lusk and Ms. Mussog for that update.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The budget for FY 2021 is projecting to end the year with a surplus of $174,800. We are actually exceeding that at the end of the third quarter with a surplus of $1.3 million from operations in our $35.2 million operating budget. This surplus is primarily a timing issue where we have collected funds in advance of expenses being recognized. The two programs that are driving the increase in the projected fund balance are the regional housing impact analysis with about $500,000, and the second is the Street Smart program with about $100,000. The increase in the undesignated fund balance is driven by the actual indirect reimbursement being higher than our target, which is a timing issue in various Department of Environmental programs, projects that have received undesignated funds in advance of the actual spend. Operating revenue and expenses are tracking lower to both the FY 2021 budget and mid-year totals for the prior year. This is in large part also a timing issue, as we expect to track closer to the FY 21 budget by year end, with the exception of some spending in the commuter connections program. Due to COVID-19 restrictions, promotional expense has decreased significantly, and we do not expect this to rise to the budgeted levels before the end of 2021. This is a cost reimbursement program, so both the expenses and revenues will be lower than what we've actually budgeted. The one major variance on the statement of revenue, expense, and change in net position is in the subrecipient pass-through funds, which are at a 20% lower amount than originally budgeted. Pass-through funds for a repower project budgeted in FY 2021 have not yet been received, but the project was approved for funding late in December, and we expect to have some of those budgeted revenues in FY 21, but the bulk will come and be pushed into FY 2022. Most of the funds for this program are paid to outside entities for direct project expenses. The statement of net position as of March 21st, 2021 shows an overall increase in net assets of $1.2 million. This increase reflects the impact of the third quarter operating surplus, which I think is pretty good. Overall, COG remains fiscally healthy. The board designated reserves are at 100% of funding, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have, and we'll also refer to Ms. Mussog if necessary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Ms. Mussog, did you have anything additional?
No, Supervisor Lusk has been very thorough, and just wanted to reiterate that we're in a healthy position as of the end of third quarter, despite revenues tracking lower than budget. Since these are primarily related to cost reimbursable projects, we are in a very healthy position and don't expect to have any significant issues related to that lower revenue tracking.
Thank you very much. I know that the executive team has had an opportunity to go through this in detail, but I wonder if there are any other questions. I do want to note that there's no action item on this agenda, but want to see if other board members have questions. Hearing none, we will move. Let me thank you both, Mr. Lusk and Ms. Mussall, for the update. Really appreciate the update and the work that you all are doing. We will move to agenda item 9, the fiscal year 2022 work program and budget. For this item, COG's Executive Director Chuck Bean and the Chief Financial Officer Julie Mussall will brief the board on the proposed fiscal year 2022 COG work program and budget. Following that presentation, the board will be asked to adopt resolution R27-2021 on page 40 of your board packets as recommended by COG's Budget and Finance Committee. So with that, let me turn it over to Mr. Bean to introduce the work program and budget.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Slide 2, please. Julie and I will double team this and then pass it to the Budget and Finance Committee at the end. So this budget focus remains on a balanced budget, seeking to maximize the leveraging of general funds for programs focused on COG's mission and priorities in transportation, public health, prosperity, housing, public safety, and environmental protection. Julie, let's go to next slide, and I'll turn it to you.
Thank you. The proposed FY22 budget of $49.3 million is higher than the current year FY21 budget of $41.2 million, primarily driven by some transportation-related work programs and additional pass-through funds for enhanced mobility. The FY22 budget, as previously reviewed by the Budget and Finance Committee and proposed here, reflects prior year fund balance use of about $700,000. This is related to the regional housing analysis and some public safety funds that were previously mentioned in the third quarter financial review. There's also a small surplus of general funds that have not been specifically identified for use in some environmental programs, but the expectation is that that picture will be clearer as the year progresses and the overall general fund budget will remain neutral. If you can go to the next slide. On slide 4, we see the complete FY22 work program and budget is a 78-page document, and there is a link included under the publication on the May 12, 2021 COG Board of Directors webpage. Some highlights by program area are transportation planning is our largest funded work program at $18.1 million. The bulk of this is core MPO budget work that's already been approved by the Transportation Planning Board. This is 37% of the total budget. This is followed by transportation operations at 32% of the total budget. And this is lots of funding for commuter connections and some pass-through funding, especially related to enhanced mobility grants. These enhanced mobility grants are always greater in the even budget years at COG. Water resources, environmental resources, and air quality together total $9.9 million, of which $2.7 million is pass-through related to engine repower projects. This represents 20% of the proposed budget. Homeland Security is about $3.3 million in pass-through and operating funds and is about 7% of the total budget. Making up the remaining 5% of the budget is community planning services, strategic initiatives, and member services. And this is work related to core support work for the MPO and long-range forecasts, strategic initiatives like housing, and work on the reopening and vaccine coordination. Can we go to the next slide? Sources of our $49.3 million in revenue. Single largest source is federal government at 62%. These funds primarily support the MPO, transportation operations, including enhanced mobility pass-through grants and some FEMA pass-through money. The second largest slice of that is the state revenue. This revenue is primarily funding for commuter connections, the transportation match for the core MPO work, and environmental work. The third largest funding source at 9% is member dues. Most of these funds are used as a match to leverage the federal and state and other regional project funds. And this is the primary support for our work in housing and health, for example. I'll turn it back over to Chuck and the next slide.
Good. The next 2 slides calls out a half dozen of the core priorities. As much as we would like the pandemic to be in our rearview mirror, there's still lots of work to do on the COVID-19 response and recovery. So we'll be continue working areas of vaccine distribution and accompanying efforts, including messaging related to vaccines. We will also expect to continue work to understand and support economic recovery post-pandemic, including the long-term impacts of COVID on transportation planning, food security, climate, homelessness, and housing. Before the pandemic disrupted activities, COG had recognized transit-oriented communities as a priority strategy, and we'll be continuing to work on that. Will also be a main focus of the organization, a strong partnership with the TPB to finalize the update on the region's long-range transportation plan, Visualize 2045. As part of this effort, staff will conduct outreach to help members advance its aspirational initiatives, which includes more housing closer to jobs and climate change. Underpinning all of COG's work and consistent with the board's direction is a focus on advancing racial equity. Our racial equity work has two components: an internal component where we are working to educate our employees on racial equity considerations and provide them tools needed to consider equity as they develop policy choices for regional consideration. And also external to the COG organization are initiatives, a racial equity audit of homeless services in the region, and our fair housing analysis for the region, which began a month ago. Next slide, please. COG continues to work regionally to refine and implement agreements that help ensure public safety, including the mutual aid operations plan, the fire and rescue plans, and the emergency management plans. We've also recently begun to work directly with federal officials who are seeking improvement in the manner in which federal law enforcement agencies interact with local law enforcement agencies, particularly during no-notice events. The goal here is to develop a more seamless approach to federal local interaction and to clear impediments to support. The events of June 2020 and then January 2021 highlight the need for continued work on this kind of coordination. Staff will also continue to work with the Homeland Security Executive Committee and CEO committees to continue to refine strategic security priorities and create alignment between our strategic direction and our funding of project priorities. In environment, notably, staff will continue to work with jurisdictions to create best practices for stream restoration, consider options for regionally reducing coastal and overland flooding. We will also actively be working on implementing the 2030 Climate Energy Action Plan, which is on the agenda today, to realize greenhouse gas reductions. Housing, and a couple of notable activities within housing is the regional study to look at impediments to fair housing in the region. And many of your housing departments are participating in this study. And in food security, COG staff will continue to work with a relatively new farm ad hoc committee to identify regional opportunities to reduce food insecurity issues and support agricultural efforts that quite literally feed people in the region. I'm anticipating discussion of the direction of this program in June and at our July retreat. So Julie, just a couple more slides.
So some highlights from the budget are, I wanted to note that there was a member dues rate decrease of 0.5 cent from the FY21 rate, and that was voted on by the COG board back in October. Operating revenues increased $3.5 million or 10% over the FY21 work program. This is a combination of new programs and additional funding for existing programs. New programs include advanced transportation and congestion management technologies deployment, state planning and research, and a grant for military installations resilience review. Subrecipient revenue pass-through increases by $4.6 million for enhanced mobility grants, which are on a biannual basis, and the reserves are also fully funded. Going to the next slide, slide 9. Board designated reserves. In FY22, we expect to maintain the operating reserve at the FY21 year-end balance of $5.2 million. This is reflective of a balanced budget for FY22 with zero use of operating reserves. The reserve will remain funded at the 100% policy level. COG's capital reserve is funded at $5.1 million. Capital expenditure plan is a rolling 5-year plan with the next iteration to come to the board in September. The bottom line is we're good. Our reserves are good. They're adequately funded for any economic uncertainty. And although not part of the operating budget, I wanted to mention that we're on solid ground with our pension. I just received the actuarial report, and we are at a 106% funded ratio on an actuarial basis and 116% funded ratio on a market value basis as of 12/31/2020. And then with that, I'll turn it over to you, Chuck.
Thank you. Last slide, please. Just wrapping up with a reminder of the timetable. As a routine, the Budget and Finance Committee comes to the board in October regarding member dues. We do that early because this enables city and county managers to incorporate those assumptions into their budgets. From October to the present, we monitor finances and needs and plan accordingly. Executive Committee, along with the rest of the Budget and Finance Committee, met in April to review and discuss this work program and budget for consideration by the board, which would be implemented on July 1. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I turn it back to you and the Budget and Finance Committee for consideration of Resolution R27.
Thank you very much. I'll now ask for a motion and a second to approve Resolution R27-2021.
This is Penny
So
Gross.
moved,
I'd be
Mr.
happy to
Chair.
move approval.
Motion and a second. Is there any discussion?
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Penny Gross.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to bring to the board's attention the fiscal condition of a board that we're all appointed to is something quite often elected officials aren't terribly interested in. I found over the years, we depend on our staff to make sure it's taken care of, and it's not the same as our own individual county and city budgets, jurisdictional budgets. But I will say that about 15 years ago, we established some reserves at COG because it was a good thing to do. And over the years, some of those reserves and policy has changed a little bit, but we are in a much better position than we were a number of years ago. And it's due to both the policy changes and to really good stewardship by our staff, our financial staff. It is light years from where we used to be. Just wanted to make that point. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other discussion? Hearing none, are there any additional questions from members from Maryland? Questions from members from Virginia? The District of Columbia? Right, hearing no more seconds, I would now call for a vote to approve Resolution R27-2021. Are there any abstentions or nay votes? Hearing none. Hearing none, the motion passes. Moving to agenda item 10. We're joined by the leadership of COG's election officials, the committee including Loudoun County Office of Elections Deputy Registrar Richard Keish, Montgomery County Deputy Elections Director Allison McLaughlin, and District of Columbia Board of Elections General Counsel Terry Stroud, who will brief us on plans for upcoming elections in our region. You can view this information about the committee and upcoming elections on page 49 of the packet. And with that, let me turn it over to Mr. Keish.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. My name is Richard Keach. I'm the Deputy Director of Elections in Loudoun County, and I'm the co-chair of the Council of Governments Election Committee. With me are Allison McLaughlin, Deputy Director of Elections in Montgomery County, my co-chair, and Terry Stroud, General Counsel for the DC Board of Elections, the Secretary of our committee. I would like to thank you for having us here today. The last time we were before you was in August of last year. The pandemic was in full swing and all of our jurisdictions had successfully conducted at least one election at that point. In Loudoun, we had done 3. We were well into preparation for the November 2020 presidential election. I think I speak for all of us when I say that last year's presidential election was the most stressful election any of us have ever conducted. We were faced with a pandemic, constant news coverage, scared and angry voters, intense scrutiny, and the occasional accusation of impropriety. But we ran what is just about, by every measure, an incredibly successful election, and I commend the election administrators in the Metro DC region. Many of us look back and we really aren't quite sure how we pulled it off, but we did. The election committee had continued to meet virtually throughout the pandemic, sharing ideas and best practices. We have provided you today with an updated packet of information outlining the ways voting differs by jurisdiction. The biggest change you'll see is the exponential increase in early and mail voting. Throughout the region, over 75% of the voters who voted in November 2020 either did so by early voting or by mail. Trends had been moving in the direction of pre-election day voting for quite some time, but 2020 was like nothing any of us had ever seen. We were required to completely retool our operations on the fly while ensuring that everything remains secure and that the voters and our staff remain safe. This year, my colleagues in Maryland and DC are taking a bit of a breather while they prepare for 2022, but in Virginia, we are preparing to run a statewide primary, followed by a November election, where we will elect statewide officials and the entire House of Delegates. In Virginia, numerous changes to the way we vote have been enacted by the state legislature over the past few years. We now have a 45-day window of no excuse early and mail voting, which were a huge success in November. In Loudoun County alone, we saw the percentage of voters voting by mail or early in person go from a little over 17% of total voters in 2016 to about 70% in 2020. To put that into numbers, in 2016 in Loudoun County, we handled about 32,000 voters by mail or in person, and in 2020, that number was about 157,000. We expect the interest in mail and early voting to continue as time goes on. In 2020, Virginia also moved some deadlines to request your mail ballot up to 11 days prior to the election, and we extended the deadline to return those mail ballots. We've given voters an extra 2.5 days, and they must be received by our office no later than noon on the Friday after the election. Other laws recently changed in Virginia include the removal of photo ID requirement. Voters are still required to show ID, but they do not have to contain a picture. In 2020, Election Day was officially made a state holiday. Our voter registration is now automatic when conducting a transaction at the DMV, unless the voter chooses to opt out. There is ongoing discussion regarding changing the way results are reported from mail-in early voting to recognize the massive shift towards that method. And lastly, the state is currently in the process of replacing our aging centralized voter registration system. Security remains, as always, a top priority for all election officials, and we continue to avail ourselves of training and resources to ensure that the elections we run are safe, secure, and accessible for voters. In Virginia, all localities are currently undertaking a security review and revising our policies and procedures as needed to address our current needs. I thank you for your time, and I will now turn it over to my colleague, Allison McLaughlin.
Thank you, Ricky. Thank you so much for your remarks, but also for your continued leadership of the Election Officials Technical Committee. I would like the COG board to know that this group is really an invaluable tool for election officials throughout the region, and we really appreciate COG's sponsorship of us and work with us. This last year, it was not just an information sharing body, it was really an emotional support group as well. And so we really find that to be very valuable, and we're looking forward to being able to get back into the office as well when we can come use your meeting rooms again someday. In Maryland, and Ricky spoke to a lot of how the elections are conducted, how the changes are in Virginia. You have the chart in your packet of some of the variation of how these laws are throughout the region. What we're doing is so different. Our hats really go off to our colleagues in Virginia. It seems like you have an election every other week. We have much less frequent elections. We have longer ballots for those elections, more contests on the ballot at once, except that we have the counties that run the federal, state, and county offices, and then the municipalities really run their own elections and have the opportunity to experiment and innovate with that. And so that's where we are right now. We really, we upended our election process entirely in 2020. The governor has very broad emergency authority. And worked with our state board of elections to really just completely reinvent our election process. We went to vote centers for that 1 year and 1 year only. Might be back on the table. We might look at it again in the future as a policy direction, but the way we ran elections in 2018 is not totally different from the way that we're going to run elections in 2022 with this sort of blip in the charts of how elections were conducted in 2020, with a few exceptions. For the 2022 election, voters are going to continue to have these choices, and we will mail out a ballot application. We will not be mailing out a ballot, but we will be mailing out the application, and we will keep the drop boxes that proved to be so popular for voters. Now, we don't know where those drop boxes are going to be. We put a lot of them at the schools, and we were placing them where the cameras were. So that, of course, meant they were in the bus lanes in the 2020 election. And that's going to be a different sort of dynamic as we look to 2022 when you've got kids, schools in session and buses loading and offloading. So we're working to see what we need to change in terms of the placement of those drop boxes, but it will be available as an option for voters. Voters are going to continue to have those choices. And they're going to vote with their feet and tell us over time whether the future of elections in Maryland looks more like a vote by mail environment or whether it looks more like an in-person environment. And our legislature will look at that in the future. The chart that you have in your packet speaks to the dramatic increase in the percentage of voters who voted some way other than election day. They voted by mail or they voted early. When you break that down even further, in Maryland statewide, it was about half and half of those who voted by mail and those who voted in person. And actually in my jurisdiction in Montgomery County, it was 65% who voted by mail. We don't expect 65% to vote by mail in 2022, but we don't know what percentage of our voters are going to vote by mail and what percentage are going to show up and vote in person on election day. We will have an expanded number of sites and expanded hours for early voting. Our voting hours are going to now be the same every day, just like election day. The hours will be the same for us. That's 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. We're going to have some additional early voting sites that are mandated by the legislature. But election day, having just last year trained all of our voters, taught all of our voters, put a lot of work into telling our voters that they could go to any high school. Next year, we're telling them, no, don't do that. Please don't do that. You do that, you're going to have to vote a provisional ballot. We need you to go to your assigned polling place in your community on election day. And so that is going to be a big outreach effort. We have a lot of sort of unlearning for our voters to do about what our process is. And so, outreach is really going to be a big factor going into 2022. My colleague, Gilberto Zelaya, our outreach coordinator, likes to compare voting options to like the Cheesecake Factory menu. After a while, it kind of gets overwhelming. And so we need to really winnow down our messages, work with our colleagues in the region, work with COG, since obviously we're all pretty much in the same major media market, but our rules are all different. And so we really appreciate that opportunity to work through COG. I will turn the mic over to my colleague, Terry, who will talk about the DC Board of Elections.
Good afternoon, everyone. I want to second everything that Ali Soon and Ricky said about gratitude towards COG for the support that you provided. 2020 was a very difficult election year. It feels like we were beset on all sides, but somehow managed to learn from whatever mistakes were made during the primary election to pull off what has widely been viewed as a very successful general election. As Ricky noted, as of now, the next scheduled elections for the district are not until 2022. Currently, the primary is scheduled to be held on the third Tuesday in June, June 21st, and the general election, of course, is scheduled for November 8th. So for the November general election, we did mail a ballot to every registered voter, which was different from what we did in the primary, where we mailed an application to every voter to apply for receipt of an absentee ballot. We also utilized vote centers for 8 days, including on election day. Normally in the District of Columbia on election day, we have precinct-based voting, and so voters have to go to their assigned precinct in order to have their ballot counted. If you vote out of precinct, your ballot won't count. But for this past election cycle, every day, including election day, vote centers were in place, which was a very, the voters really enjoyed that, being able to go wherever to one of 95 vote centers throughout the District of Columbia to vote and have their vote counted. Turnout for the 2020 general election was just under 67%. Of the voters who voted, about a little over 8% voted on election day. 23% of voters voted early. 46.24% of voters who cast ballots utilized one of the 55 drop boxes that were located throughout the district, mainly outside of the district's public libraries. There were only a few that did not have a drop box outside. About 20% of voters cast their ballots through USPS, and we had about 5,300 military and overseas voters who cast ballots either by email, mail, or fax. So we're exploring how we're going to administer elections for the 2022 election cycle, looking at lessons learned from the past cycle and considering voter input. The board has held several town halls, and there's a strong sentiment on the part of the public to continue with mail-in ballots. And also the drop boxes, which were hugely successful. I wanted to highlight some new features of voting in the District of Columbia, the most significant of which is the Restore the Vote Act, which was legislation that was passed by the council and was sponsored and championed by Board Chairman White. And that legislation restored the franchise to district voters who are incarcerated for felony offenses in the Bureau of Prisons, the Federal Bureau of Prisons, or the Department of Corrections. And so for the 2020 general election, 248 DC residents who were incarcerated at Federal Bureau of Prisons across the country, and 333 residents incarcerated in the district's Department of Corrections were able to cast ballots in the 2020 general election. We're also exploring ways to enhance the delivery of registration and voter services to our incarcerated district residents. And it's something that we've been getting a lot of feedback, positive feedback for across the country. So I just wanted to highlight that. But again, thank you for being such a support network for election officials. It was a difficult year. Several of us across the country faced threats to our safety, condemnation from both sides, allegations of fraud, or just telling us that we had to get things absolutely perfectly on the other side of that. So it was difficult, and all in the midst of a pandemic where you plan for one method of delivering elections, and then at the drop, you just got to, switch things around on a dime. And so it was a rough year, but we made it through and were able to, pull off a successful general election throughout the region. So thank you for all the support that you provided. And a special thank you to Ali Soon and Ricky, who have been like sounding boards for me personally and professionally. So thank you very much, you two.
I want to thank you all for joining us today. We have about 5 minutes for questions, and I did want to start by thanking Ms. Stroud and her team for implementing the Restore the Vote Act with very little runway. Just did a phenomenal job getting that going, and it meant so much to what turned out to be several hundred people who voted, many for the first time. One question for Ms. McLaughlin. You mentioned the confusion in instructing residents to kind of go back to their normal polling stations. Why go back to where we were, kind of by any measure? Were there things about the 2021 election that didn't work that we need to fix, or can we really just continue to vote anywhere in the jurisdiction?
I think that opinions just really haven't solidified about that yet. And I think the legislature just really wants to wait and see. One of the features of what we did in 2020, we were able to take advantage of high schools. They were available. They were empty. We were able to move into them. And we can expect to be able to do that during the school year for the length of time that we would need to. So that's a big factor. I mean, we just simply need to, it's a challenge as it stands already for the length of time and the number of recreation sites in particular that we, kick other functions out when we move in to stand up voting. And so it's a pretty big commitment of the facilities that would be required in order to go to that on a permanent basis. And our legislature and, you know, our local communities are going to need to grapple with that as we evaluate this moving forward.
Thank you for that. Are there additional questions from board members? Any questions from members from Maryland? Members from Virginia?
Hey, Ricky, it's Chair Randall. Do you think we can do something about that having elections every year thing in Virginia?
If you could do that, you'd probably be our hero.
Because you know what? It's not fun.
Well, and you know, I was actually talking with Chuck this morning, and we're seeing pretty sad turnout for the primary.
Well,
I mean,
you
our
know,
number one
because
early voting day has been 25 people so far.
it seriously, it is exhausting, and it's hard for people to stay engaged all the time. I mean, everyone's not, you know, us. We're kind of crazy people, so it's hard for people to stay engaged all the time. So if you and Chuck can fix that, I really appreciate that.
Well, I can tell you, I did miss one thing in my report. The legislature did move all towns to November.
Yeah,
now.
they did
So
do that.
They did eliminate one of
They
our
did do that.
3 elections every other year. So that was a little bit of relief. And election administrators loved it. The towns maybe not so much, but we all loved it.
All right, thanks.
But yes,
Thanks
I
for all
agree.
you do. You do a great job in Loudoun County. I appreciate you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Any other questions from members from Virginia? And members from the District of Columbia? So I will mention one thing. The issue of elections has been a national conversation and one that will be ongoing for some time. And there's no action item on this agenda for us today, but I think there might be interest within the COG board to develop and consider a resolution in the future that affirms election rules and procedures that promote active participation. And see a couple nods. So Chuck, would it be okay to direct staff to consider developing such a resolution and maybe engage a task force, if appropriate, for future consideration?
Yes, I think if I see head nods, particularly from the co-chairs election committee, Mr. Keach and Ms. McLaughlin, if they were able to contribute to that, we could set up a task force at the next board meeting and come back to the board in the fall. My assumption is that this would be an affirmative resolution about election integrity, affirmative statements about active participation in governments. That would be audience would be, of course, the DMV, and then for consideration by the task force would the audiences also be Virginia and Maryland.
That would be,
the answer is yes.
Wonderful, wonderful. I appreciate that. So for our next agenda item 11, the board will be briefed on the point in time count for persons experiencing homelessness in our region, which is completed by COG's Homeless Services Committee. You can review the executive summary of this on page 60 of the board package, or access the link to the full report on the COG website. So now we will hear from the co-chairs of the committee, Fairfax County Office to Prevent and End Homelessness, Director Tom Barnett, and District of Columbia Interagency Council on Homelessness, Christy Greenwald. Welcome to you both, and I'm going to turn it over to Christy Greenwald. Very good to have you.
Good afternoon, Chairman and members of the board. My name is Christy Greenwald, and together with our Homeless Services Committee co-chairs Tom Barnett and Elizabeth Young, we are really grateful to be able to be with you today to present the results of the 21st annual point in time count. I also want to thank the other 9 participating jurisdictions for all their support pulling this data together. I know it's a huge lift every year. And COG staff as well, and especially Hillary Chapman, who does just the enormously heavy lift of pulling this report together for us. So a special thank you to her. I'm going to provide just a little bit of context on the point in time count, so you all have a sense of what you're looking at as we run through these numbers. But we will try to go through things very quickly, and then we can turn back because I'm sure there will probably be some questions, especially given it was a tremendously abnormal year for us in this regard. The point in time count is a single night snapshot of the number and characteristics of households experiencing homelessness in our region. We coordinate across jurisdictions with regard to the date we are going to conduct the enumeration. This year we did it on January 27th. And the count is an enumeration of people who are experiencing literal homelessness. So that means people that have nowhere safe to stay. They're staying in emergency shelter, transitional housing programs, or in unsheltered locations such as in tent encampments, abandoned buildings, vehicles, things of that nature. What it does not capture is larger housing instability. So this does not include, for example, a count of people who might be doubled or tripled up with family and friends, or who are couch surfing and otherwise at imminent risk of homelessness. So just so you have some context on what we're looking at and what we are not looking at. We also, in the count every year, we're tracking how many people have exited homelessness and are still being supported in housing by the homeless services system in programs like permanent supportive housing and rapid rehousing. So we'll run through those numbers with you a little bit later in this presentation as well. Just as a reminder, the PIC count is a requirement from the federal government. This is a HUD requirement for any jurisdiction that receives federal homeless services funding. It goes without saying, as I mentioned, this was not a typical year for us. HUD did offer some waivers to jurisdictions. I think we all felt like it was very important to continue with the count to try to start to get an baseline understanding of how the public health emergency might be impacting housing insecurity and homelessness. But clearly it's going to take some time for us to fully see the full impact of the pandemic on housing insecurity and instability in the region. We've, of course, followed CDC and local health department guidance as we were conducting the count in January to protect both our neighbors experiencing homelessness as well as our outreach staff and volunteers. But again, I think, like I said, this is sort of, keep in mind, this is really just at a first cut at what we're seeing. I think actually next year's data is going to be more telling around how the pandemic has impacted housing insecurity. Okay, so let's start with the numbers then. If we go to this first table is really taking a look at our total numbers. So total households, this includes single adults, or so individuals that present not as part of a family household. It includes people in family households, and it includes unaccompanied minors. So this is our total number. One important piece of context, I just want to remind you, this is a snapshot of a single night, right? So this is how many people are that were homeless as of January 27th. But there are inflows and outflows every single night of the year. New people experience homelessness. Other people leave the homeless services system to housing. So the number of people, so in some way, the point in time count minimizes the scope of the problem and the challenge that we all face. When you look at how many people experience homelessness throughout the course of the year, it's much larger, at least a factor of 2 to 3 times larger than this point in time number. So I just want to mention that because I think it'll come up a little bit as we continue looking at this data. But with regard to the point in time count, which again, this is one piece of data that we use to look at what's happening in our system, and the point in time helps us really track trends from one year to the next. So what we saw between 20 and 21 was a reduction of almost 1,500 people, or a 15% reduction. The district, of course, is a pretty big driver of those numbers just because of our scope, our scale compared to other suburban counties. But the trends are actually pretty consistent across jurisdictions. Most jurisdictions saw a decrease in the number of people that were homeless in January 2021 compared to January 2020. And again, I'm sure there'll be questions about this, but we'll probably have a few minutes for questions when we run through the numbers. So if we go to the next slide, we're really looking at a breakdown of homelessness by household type. So again, that first column in white is individual, people that present as individuals. The second column is the number of people that present as part of a family household. And that third column in white is the number of unaccompanied minors that we identified during the count. What you'll notice here, again, is that first column, single adults, over the last 5 years, that number has remained stubbornly flat. And again, this is not a static population. There are people flowing in and out every day. All of the jurisdictions are working hard to move people into housing, but we've had a really hard time keeping up with inflow in our single adult system, such that we've actually seen a 5% increase over the last 5 years. The real story here, though, is the decline in family homelessness. And so that's captured in that second white column. There has been a pretty dramatic decrease over the last 5 years, from almost 5,500 households in January of 2017 to about 2,400 people and families as of January 2021. So that's about a 57% reduction. And again, there's a few different things happening here, and you know, the district and I think all the jurisdictions have been making really concerted efforts to transform their systems, working to prevent homelessness wherever possible, to help exit people back into housing as quickly as possible. A significant amount of the resources, especially in the district, have been allocated to families. I think that is really driving some of the trend line here. We also, though, over the last year, there's a remarkable decrease between 2020 and 2021. No doubt the eviction moratorium played a role in that. We saw a slowdown in inflow over the last year, which is a good thing, but it also might mean that there's still an effect that we're going to see in the months ahead when that eviction moratorium is lifted. So there's a few different competing variables here when we look at family homelessness. Okay, if we could go to the next slide, we're going to take a look at chronic homelessness. Chronic homelessness, as defined by the federal government, we're talking about an individual with a disabling condition who has experienced long-term homelessness. So officially, as defined by HUD, that's consecutively for a year or longer they've been homeless, or they've had 4 or more episodes within 3 years. But the easy way to think about this is really just who's experiencing long-term homelessness. It's the subset of our population that really has the most vulnerabilities and the highest level of barriers to housing stability. So one thing we see here, the number of people who are actually experiencing chronic homelessness in our region has increased slightly from 2017 to 2021 by about 4%. Although that number between 2020 and 2021 was a much more significant increase by about 17%. Again, there's a lot of different factors here around why we're seeing an increase in chronic homelessness. But the number one reason is really simply just comes down to the fact that the scale of need relative to the amount of housing resources that we all have available to help people means we don't have the ability to help someone with housing the second they experience our homeless services system. And a lot of people end up timing into this chronic definition of HUD's chronic definition. So part of it is I mean, really it's a system problem, right? We are actually sort of creating chronic homelessness because we don't have the resources to help people quickly enough. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Tom Barnett from Fairfax County to walk you through more of the demographics of what we're seeing in our population.
Good afternoon. If we could go to the next slide. The region's continuums of care have been tracking demographic data on people experiencing homelessness to better understand the disparate impacts and to address gaps in our regional systems response. As shown on this slide, both single adults and persons and families are most likely to report their racial identity is Black or African American. On the left-hand side, you see that 75% of single adults and 82% of persons and families responded that they are Black, compared to the region's population as a whole on the right, where only 25% of persons are identified as Black or African American. It is important to note that a root cause of the disproportionate representation of people of color is a legacy of institutional and systemic racism that impacts our communities to this day. In recognition of this racial disparity, as Mr. Bean mentioned earlier on in the presentation in the meeting, the 9 participating jurisdictions and COG's Homeless Services Committee has just launched a year-long collaboration with the consulting firm C4 Innovations, a nationwide leader in addressing racial inequities and homelessness. This collaboration will examine our homeless services systems, both locally and regionally, to find ways to create a more racially equitable approach to ending the experience of homelessness. We look forward to sharing the results of that collaboration with you next year. Next slide, please. Since 2017, the region has reduced the number of homeless veterans by 16%. The overall reduction in the veteran homelessness count is attributable to the targeted funding from the federal government to assist veterans in the form of Veterans Affairs Supportive Housing, or VASH vouchers, as well as the Supportive Services for Veteran Families, or SSVF program. Note that compared to 2020, the reduction is relatively small. The difference was a decrease of 12 persons across the region. But please understand that, as Christy mentioned, there's inflow and outflow. Many of the 406 people that you see counted this year are not the same from the year or two prior. Every year, our community partners are preventing hundreds from becoming homeless and housing hundreds more to sustain our progress. It's also important to note for this slide that veteran status was not gathered in the city of Frederick and Frederick County. The city and county chose to implement a shortened version of the survey this year to reduce the time interacting with persons experiencing unsheltered homelessness. And of course, the ability to reduce the number of homeless veterans further is constrained without additional permanent housing resources. Next slide, please. Permanent housing is the ultimate solution to ending homelessness. I can never emphasize this point enough. This includes unsubsidized and subsidized housing like permanent supportive housing and rapid rehousing. Regional progress continues to be made by finding new housing opportunities for people in need. This bar chart highlights the increase in the overall number of formerly homeless individuals and families who secured permanent supportive housing, were rapidly rehoused, or found other types of permanent housing. In blue, you see that the permanent housing placements grew as the number of people experiencing homelessness in orange decreased. In 2021, there was an 11% increase in permanent housing placements compared to 2020, and a 31% increase since 2017. The significant number of people moved to permanent housing has reduced the prevalence of homelessness in the region since 2017. This housing strategy reinforces the need to provide more affordable housing resources to people experiencing homelessness and low-income households in the region. This is crucial to prevent people from becoming homeless or to move them into some form of permanent housing as quickly as possible if they become homeless. In addition, as the economy recovers, we need to provide robust workforce development programs to assist low-wage, low-skilled workers to secure better paying jobs in order to afford the high cost of housing in the region. Next slide, please. In conclusion, the context in which homeless services systems are operating is now dramatically different than they were a year ago. However, we have learned a great deal from the coordinated local, state, and federal actions on how to prevent homelessness and to keep people safe from the virus. We should celebrate the hard work the region's 9 continuums of care have accomplished to reach this milestone. Together, we are ensuring that homelessness is rare, brief, and non-recurring. COG's Homeless Services Committee members would highlight the importance that homelessness prevention and diversion programs, coupled with the eviction moratorium mentioned by Christy, has had in reducing the flow of people entering homeless service systems region-wide. We therefore recommend strengthening these programs to ensure we find alternatives to homelessness for people experiencing a housing crisis. In addition, emergency rental assistance and targeted housing vouchers funded by multiple sources allowed the regions to move people into permanent housing, even if challenged by the move to online operations. American Rescue Plan housing resources such as the newly announced emergency housing vouchers and the Home Investment Partnership Fund will allow us to continue to do this important work. COG's Homeless Services Committee further recommends that the response to this pandemic must be centered on racial equity. People of color are disproportionately represented in the homeless services system, as well as in COVID-19 infections and deaths. Ensuring that our response to this pandemic does not compound existing inequities is paramount as we think about our work in the year ahead. A key component in being able to work together effectively as a region is being able to share data, as mentioned in the Compact End Homelessness adopted by the board earlier this year. There's much work still to be done to improve our capability of working across jurisdictional boundaries and resolving a person's experience of homelessness, though. Access to permanent housing as a solution cannot be emphasized enough. During a pandemic without a home, it is especially challenging to stay healthy and safe, and that is why we say housing is healthcare. In closing, thank you again for the opportunity to present the results from this year's point in time count of the region's residents experiencing homelessness. Please note that at the end of this report are summaries from the 9 participating jurisdictions, which provide details on some of their point in time results, local homeless services, and their accomplishments. At this time, we would be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, Ms. Greenwald and Mr. Barnett, for sharing the results of the regional report. Do want to facilitate questions from board members. So let me start with the District of Columbia this time. Are there any questions from members from the District of Columbia? Hearing none. Any questions from members from Virginia? I see a couple. Let me start with Phyllis Randall and then move to George Barker.
Thank you for that presentation and for everyone that worked on it. Could you just, you mentioned it just briefly, could you just talk a little bit more about the COVID effects on homelessness this year, since there was so much money given in relief, rental relief, and so people who may have obviously been put out their homes for whatever reason were not this year. Do you think that made a difference? And if so, how do we, and for lack of a better word, try to ensure that those people don't have a negative rebound next year when they don't have that rental relief money?
So I can jump in, and Tom, I'm sure you have thoughts as well. I think, I actually think to this point, it's been the eviction moratorium that has really been what has slowed inflow into the system, because the money by and large is still just getting out the door. Certainly we've had access to some emergency rental assistance over the last, over the second half of 2020, but the really big tranches of funding are just starting to hit the street. And so the extent to which we will be able, the opportunity is there, but we all as jurisdictions have to really, do everything we can to make sure that those resources are getting into, reaching our most vulnerable neighbors to stave off homelessness. But you're right that this is one-time money. And so this can be helpful for folks that are able to get reconnected to the labor market. It's not necessarily, a lot of the federal stimulus money is not necessarily, I should say there also is some money that is targeted towards homelessness, and we actually just are hearing more about that over the last couple of days, learning what we're all receiving. But that one-time money, like I said, there's a big opportunity to slow inflow into homelessness. But again, it's going to take some very strategic implementation and we all struggle with capacity and how we're going to scale our programs to get those resources out the door. So I think that's one thing that we all need to be thinking about, is how to make sure we can run these programs effectively. Tom, I'm sure you have thoughts as well.
Yeah, I would just add connection between housing and healthcare that I mentioned, it was made plainly obvious by the COVID-19 pandemic. Using non-congregate sheltering has been really essential to prevent infections for people that are at high risk of serious illness, as well as isolating and quarantining folks who are infected or symptomatic. And that's been really important over the past year. But many of those programs are going to be closing down in the coming months as federal resources for those temporary non-congregate shelter options disappear. And so switching from temporary housing to permanent housing options with these new federal resources is sort of the challenge over the next year or two.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
If I might jump in here, thank you. You called me earlier, and I'm sort of following up on the same issue. I mean, you can see in the data that 4 of the 5 large jurisdictions in Northern Virginia had significant decreases, pretty sizable decreases pretty much across the board in the number of people. And it was appears to be particularly focused on families where there's been the large decrease there. We established early in the process last summer of using funds to initially from the CARES Act and then from additional funds that we've gotten since then to target that relief and make it available to both renters and landlords, so that landlords, if they were not being paid, they could access the money on behalf of their tenants and wouldn't have to try to figure something to get them out of the apartment or the house. In addition, we had set up things where we'd have long-term repayment agreements from those who would be able to do that. That's been fairly successful, but not universally successful, and that close to half of the families have been able to make the payments that they've committed to, but others have not. And of course, this is all happening at a time when we have had extraordinarily high numbers of people who have lost jobs. And many of them have regained jobs. Some are not even, have sort of given up on jobs, at least till we get past the pandemic period here. But it seems as though we've done a much better job helping people get through this when there are large numbers of people who've been affected, and particularly a lot of families, than we were doing before this. And so I think, part of the thing now is sort of how can we build on what we've learned from this set of programs. And one of the key, actually one of the major things that is helping us now, the bill that Congress passed and was signed in late December between Christmas and New Year's, we're getting $580 million in Virginia to be able to provide rent relief to people who can't afford, at least not the full amount of their rent. And I'm not sure how we could ever spend that in 1 year, just given the situation we have. So it's actually, we have a tremendous amount of money to be able to apply to this problem. And part of what we're trying to figure out is ways in which we could develop more affordable housing to be able to help deal with it long term, rather than just as plugging a hole right now. Any particular suggestions you have along that line would be helpful either now or later. So.
Well, I just want to underscore. I mean, I think you've really hit the nail on the head with like both the opportunity and the challenge here. So Virginia, you mentioned, is getting upwards of $500 million in new funding. The district, just as an example, our traditional eviction prevention program was funded in the range of 10 to 15 million a year, and we have $400 million now from the federal government. That's a huge opportunity, but that's a big change to our programming infrastructure to be able to get all that money out within the timeline that we have to spend it. So again, I just want to emphasize, I think that is something that we're all really thinking carefully about, is how do we not miss this moment? Because we finally have the dollars flowing that we've said we've needed, and we know what are the solutions to homelessness. But it's really thinking about how we strategically use this opportunity. With one-time money, one of the biggest opportunities is really acquisition of property, right? So that's certainly one of the things we're talking about in the district, is how we use some of this one-time money to acquire more property, either for non-congregate sheltering, but more importantly for affordable and supportive housing.
Right.
I would add two things. The emergency rental assistance has been very helpful, but of course we've been doing this in an environment where we were under an eviction moratorium nationwide for most of the past year. That eviction moratorium is likely to end in the next month. And so all of our preparation and our progress is now going to be put to the test as that expires, and we're going to have to be ready because evictions will start to be filed in much larger numbers. The second thing regarding the acquisition of property, hotel conversions especially are being recommended by national experts because they are oftentimes fully constructed and zoned as temporary residential use and could be acquired and kind of operated as shelter and then eventually housing in the long run.
Any additional questions? And I do want to note, I don't want to rush such an important agenda item. We're decently behind on the agenda, but I do want to make sure we get the questions. I'll only ask that we keep the questions brief, but I know I saw Ms. Bailey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Understanding the moratorium that we were just under, and I wanted to ask in terms of non-traditional housing, have you heard anything in terms of provision with portable housing? I just saw a presentation from a vendor that can do portable housing for the homeless. You know, we have a plot of land and you just, you know, you establish the portable housing there with all of the amenities. Is that a potential solution? Have you heard anything about that in terms of providing?
I can respond first. From what I've seen nationally, this sort of modular prefabricated housing has been most effective in rural communities where there is land that's relatively less expensive. And so helping keep costs down, you can buy these prefabricated units and drop them on relatively inexpensive land. I think the challenge in more densely populated areas is that the land is so expensive. The kind of the cost benefit analysis, cost effectiveness is probably to have more density. And of course, it matches more of the neighboring community if you build multifamily apartment buildings and that sort of thing. So I think depending on your community, there's different options.
Additional questions from members from Virginia and Maryland? All right, then I want to again thank you both for your presentation. Before we conclude this item, though, I do want to take the opportunity to recognize Ms. Greenwald, who will be stepping down next month from her role as the district's first ever director of in homelessness. She has served the district for 7 years and the entire region during the past year as co-chair of the COG's Homeless Services Committee. And I've had the great privilege of seeing her work and working with her. So do want to thank you for all your work and congratulate you on a job very well done. The district has made great strides in ensuring that those experiencing homelessness are only experiencing it. Well, let me not get the phrase wrong, that homelessness is rare, brief, and non-reoccurring. So I want to thank you very much for the role that you played in that work.
Thank you, Chairman. I appreciate that.
Moving to agenda item 12, the COG 2030 Climate and Energy Action Plan. This is our last item for today. And COG Director of Climate, Energy, and Air Program, Jeffrey King, and COG Deputy Executive Director of Metropolitan Planning, Kanti Srikant, will brief us on COG's 2030 Climate Energy Action Plan and the efforts that our member jurisdictions are making there. Lost my place on that. No. So let me, at this point, turn it over to Kanti.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know we are running a little bit behind, so we will be brief. We'll be happy to come back at a later time. So members will recall setting climate change as a policy priority for this region, not just for this year, for the decade as well. So this priority was manifest last year by the board adopting greenhouse gas reduction goals for 2030. And also for the first time, the region adopting resiliency goals. So COG's Climate, Energy, Environment Policy Committee developed a detailed strategy level action plan for the region to attain its 2030 climate and resiliency goals. So I'm pleased to introduce COG staff Jeff King in the newly created position of COG's Director of Climate, Energy, and Air Program. Jeff will brief you on the 2030 Climate Energy Action Plan. He'll be brief in the interest of time, but we can come back later. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Jeff, I'll hand it over to you now.
Great. Thank you, Kanti. It's my pleasure to join you all today and discuss our work on climate, energy, and air priorities. Just as background, my first role at COG back in 2004 was supporting the air quality planning effort, and I was the lead staff in 2007 and 2008 in launching our regional climate initiative. So over the last 10 years, I've been really pleased to work with all of you across a number of areas in the region to advance our climate initiative. We have become a recognized leader across many of the key sectors, including transportation, buildings, and energy. So I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to continue to support the region in this new capacity as Director of Climate, Energy, and Air. Today, I'll give you a brief update on our recent efforts to develop a new 2030 climate action plan for the region. In the presentation, I'll cover three main areas of focus. First, our new interim climate action goals. Very briefly, the process and outcomes of our 2030 climate planning process. And then I'll touch on our approach and progress in implementing the strategies and actions in the plan. As Kanti mentioned, we'd be happy to come back and provide additional information, and we have lots of supporting materials we can share as needed. So Monica, I guess next slide. So I mentioned that already. Next slide. So first, our interim emission reduction goal. So back in 2008, the COG Board adopted the National Capital Region Climate Report, which set the reduction targets of 20% emission reduction by 2020 and an 80% reduction by 2050. As we approached the 2020 goal, I think there was a recognition that we lacked interim goals between 2020 and 2050. So in 2019, the board advised the Climate, Energy, and Environment Policy Committee to develop interim climate goals. And just in October 2020, the board adopted the new 2030 climate resilience goals, which set a 50% reduction target by 2030. So that's our new goal that was adopted back in October. Next slide. In addition to setting the emission reduction goals, the board was also interested in advancing our interest in climate resilience. So the goals that were adopted in October related to resilience was basically to work towards being a climate ready region by 2030. The recognition that a lot of the investments and planning that we need to become fully resilient is going to take some time. So really the next 10 years is kind of laying the groundwork and then ultimately becoming a climate resilient region by 2050. Next slide. And I won't go into this in detail, but just to let you know that it was a bit more than a year-long process, really supported by our local membership and stakeholders, lots of interactive meetings, workshops throughout the pandemic to really dig in and identify what it is we need to put into our 2030 plan to meet these aggressive goals for 2030. We did receive very strong support internationally from a number of organizations, and I should point out we were identified as metro scale climate leaders with 4 other big metro regions in the US: Kansas City, Chicago, Denver, Minneapolis. So on November 18th, 2020, so a month after the COG board adopted the interim goals, CPC did recommend a new 2030 Climate and Energy Action Plan to COG. Next slide. The plan includes a number of guiding principles, and I won't get into those, but you can see them on the slide. Next slide. And the plan really included kind of four main elements. It looked at greenhouse gas emissions inventory and a projection, and also a scenario analysis of what it would take to attain the 2030 goal. It included, as I mentioned, the mitigation strategy. It looked at our climate risk and vulnerability, and then ultimately recommended a climate resilience strategy. Next slide. I did mention the international aspect being supported in part by the Global Covenant of Mayors. And I should note that one really interesting aspect of that, the Global Covenant of Mayors historically has been a network, a global network of over 10,000 cities and government entities throughout the world focused on best practices in climate planning. But interestingly, out of particularly Italy and areas of Belgium and France, there was a recognition that the local governments really couldn't tackle this on their own. And it really, they were calling for that regional collaboration. And hence, I mentioned the metro scale climate leaders of Kansas City, Denver, Chicago, Minneapolis, and in our region. The Europeans really interested in the good work that we've done, particularly here in the Metro DC region over the last 10 years. And then ultimately, the 2030 plan that we developed did receive recognition from the Global Covenant of Mayors, and we were the first region in the United States to achieve that status. So we are fully compliant with the global standards across the inventory, the reduction target, the CRVA, and our adaptation goals, and as well as the plan for mitigation and adaptation. Next slide. I mentioned we did look at scenarios. It's going to be pretty tough to reach our 50% goal by 2030, but our consultants and staff really took a hard look at what it would take to get there. And it's really going to take a multi-sector approach. We need to deal with our electricity, renewables, obviously our buildings, our vehicles, our travel behavior, our waste. A lot of efforts are going to be needed to get there. Next slide. And the next three slides, I'm not going to go into detail given the time constraints here, but we did identify a number of strategies and actions for priority collaborative actions in the region. I mentioned it really is going to take a multi-sector approach. We got into the need for local planning, our electricity sector, our building sector, transportation. A lot of work is being needed across all these different areas, and unfortunately, we don't have the time to get into all the details now, but happy to follow up later. You can go ahead and skip through the next two slides. Next one. And so with the couple minutes remaining here, just to touch on, now that the goal's been adopted by the board, the plan's been recommended by CPC, we're really turning our attention to implementation at this point. And I think the marching orders we need integrated multi-sector planning. And I think the three areas we're seeing currently is a lot of good local leadership happening. And we're at COG and our team and our staff across departments are doing a lot of regional coordination on that and providing technical support. So next slide. So to the local leadership, we're really pleased to see the number of local climate sustainability energy plans. We've got 13 of our members with existing plans. There's 8 current activities either to update or to develop new plans. And we're seeing probably at least 3 new plans coming soon from members that kind of behind the scenes are working with us on trying to get that process started. In addition to our energy, climate, sustainability plans, we're seeing a lot of new interest in electric vehicle planning. Clearly, I think the light duty fleet in particular, and you've seen the news on electric school buses, electric transit buses, a lot of interest in electrification and what that can do for both air quality and climate. We have 2 EV plans for community vehicles in the region. COG just finished supporting Prince George's County on an EV plan for the public sector vehicles there. There's 3 EV plans for both government and community under development, and Montgomery and Fairfax County really doing great work on school bus electrification. I'm really excited to see where that's going. And we've been really pleased to be able to assist these efforts in varying degrees. Next slide. And one thing to point out on this slide, and there's a lot there, the one thing to point out is over the last 2 or 3 years, we've developed a master contract capability. So we have 2 consultants under contract that are able to support both regional and local climate action plan development. They've been instrumental in getting some of the work started in places like Fairfax County, Prince George's County, City of Frederick, City of Rockville. So a lot of good work going on. And I encourage you to reach out if you're interested in how that process works. One other area that's really interesting to me in particular is a new program with the Department of Defense. The DoD has a military installation program where military bases and surrounding communities can work together on planning for resilience, climate resilience. And in that case, it's what can the DoD invest in our communities that would help the resilience of the base. So really interesting new program. We've just gotten that underway, a number of military bases in the region. So we look forward to continuing these types of partnerships and networking. And with that, I think I'll wrap it up and turn it back to you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you all very, very much. And I do want to let the board members know that we will have more on this in our June meeting and our retreat in July. So we'll be able to spend some more time with this. But let me turn to board members to see if there are additional questions. Are there any additional questions from board members from Maryland? I can't see, folks. If we could close the shared screen. Here we are. Thank you.
Chair White, Bridget Newton, I have a question.
Yes, please.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. King, for that report and the analysis. I'm curious if CPC youth staff has done any comparison with how your actions on climate and the report that you've given compared to the TPB Visualize 2045 plan. I'll elaborate while I give you a minute. I don't understand how we're going to meet your goals, climate action goals, when the Visualize 2045 plan seems to support continuing to build roads, lanes. I'm specifically speaking about the I-270 plan put out by MDOT SHA, which is based on pre-pandemic traffic analysis and doesn't get us anywhere near the 2030 goals that I think most of us are so, concentrating on meeting those goals. And I'm just wondering if you all looked at the 2045 plan and how it factors into your 2030 plan.
I will defer the details on some of that in the response to Conti, but I am aware that TPB staff are actively engaged and have it in their work program to do a heavy lift this year, particularly looking closely at what are the options in the transportation sector to contribute towards meeting our 2030 plan goals. Clearly a heavy lift. It is going to take multiple, all sectors to achieve this. How the goals are met within the transportation sector. It's not going. There's certainly no silver bullet. There's not one solution that can address all these needs, and it will take a multi-pronged approach. Conti, do you want to elaborate?
No, I think that's it. Thank you, Newton, for the question. I think on Jeff's slide 9 that we didn't dwell on, it does reflect the aspirational initiatives, the multi-sector working group work that was done jointly by TPB and CPC. All of that are built into the potential for attaining the 2030 goal. But the analysis that CPC did also clearly indicates the significant contribution is going to come from vehicle fleet conversion and changing the fuel composition of all vehicles. All other strategies have an important contribution to make, but they are going to be relatively of smaller magnitude. But the takeaway really is every single option needs to be on the table, number one. Every option needs to be pursued as expeditiously as possible to attain the 2030 goal within the transportation sector or within any other sector in the region.
And I totally support EV, and several of us are trying to get the city of Rockville to turn our fleet to EV. That's been a little bit of a lift. But I think along the I-270 corridor, it's not going to be the government fleets that are really driving it. It's the commuter traffic and it's everything else. I'll postpone it till next week. Kanji, thank you as always for everything you're doing. But I really think that we have got to have both sides of our of COG working together on this to really take a strong stand and do the heavy lifting. So thank you both very much.
Thank you. Any other questions from members from Maryland? Questions from members from DC? And questions from members from Virginia? Wonderful. Well, I want to thank you both for the presentation. We do look forward to hearing more about this work and reaching our regional goals at our next couple meetings. So with that, let's turn to agenda item 13, other business. We are 1:59. Is there any additional business? Wonderful. Well, hearing none, I want to thank everyone for joining us and participating in this month's COG Board of Directors meeting. The next meeting will be June 9th, and a final reminder about the COG Board retreat in July. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So move, Mr. Chair.
All right, we have a. Was that a second, Mr. Adams?
That was a second.
Wonderful, wonderful. Then we are adjourned. Thanks, everybody.
Stay safe, everyone.
Bye.
Goodbye.